Welcome back to Trail Launch Running Training. My name is Will Frantz. I am a running coach and a strength coach, and I've helped runners improve their performance from 5Ks up to 200 miles. Today, I want to talk about effort, I guess, or intensity, or however you want to frame that concept when it comes to training. And on this episode of Training in the Car, let's figure out what targets we might be trying to hit when it comes to intensity or effort, specifically with like running and cardio stuff. Um, I guess let's start there. So if you are using, when you're doing different things, we're going to be using different targets or assessment for what effort you might need to be applying to your training. All right, and this could be very obvious. It could be like lifting versus running, the way that we might use those effort metrics are going to be different. I do not care what your heart rate is when you lift things. It doesn't really matter. Um, as far as getting stronger or like making improvements or whatever, it's probably going to elevate. It's probably especially going to elevate if you do squats. Squats tend to make your heart rate skyrocket, but it's not really the adaptation we're trying to get. Unless you're a power lifter, you probably don't think that 15 reps is cardio. So we're not really trying to focus on the cardiovascular changes or the heart rate stuff when we're doing lifting. Probably need to focus more on things like reps in reserve, which would be how many like you had left in the tank on a particular set. I might focus on some version of like intensity scales. I don't know. There's a few different ways to measure it. Um, and it's usually on a 1 to 10 scale. And anybody only ever cares about 7 and up. So I don't know why we haven't just changed it to a 1 to 5 scale. But got to work with, to some degree, we got to play with the systems we have. So when we look at intensity on lifting, it's going to be much more effort and like how close you are to failure based. When we look at cardio, we have a bunch of different metrics that can be useful. And they're pretty much, I think all of them, quite literally, are a proxy for what we actually care about. Meaning that none of them are actually inherently valuable in and of themselves as a number. Like once you've trained a lot, once you've done a wide range of training, once we've experienced a bunch of different effort levels, and we can use any of these things to be a decent target for you. But in and of themselves, they don't matter. So if you wanted to be incredibly precise, as much as you really can be, we would probably do lactate testing. And that is going to, we're still on a like finger prick or ear prick system there. We do not have, at least last I checked as of a year ago, any real continuous lactate monitor. I know a ton of people are working on it because I'm sure they'll make an insane amount of money doing so. But it's not a thing that we have, or at the very least, that is accessible at the time. So right now, it is still old school, prick a finger or prick your earlobe with a needle, make yourself bleed, put that into a device that can test like millimoles of lactate, and then get the reading and see how you are. If you're willing to go through that, and to be clear, willing to go through that quite a bit, because these things can change over time and day to day, then that can really help you target training, right? You get a lactate curve, you see what yours looks like, you like look for a couple spikes on said curve, and then you know kind of what intensity or effort you're looking to hit, and then you use blood testing to make sure that you are there. And that is a very good proxy for like how many hydrogen ions you're trying to, or how much you're producing, and what effort we're creating, and mitochondrial development and all sorts of stuff. If we know your lactate curve and know what your lactate production and clearance is during a particular activity, then that's about as good as we're going to get from a certainty standpoint. And nobody I train, nobody I know actually does this. A lot of people do this. Most of them are in the Olympics or um, they make a lot of money and are really OCD about their training because lactate strips, like each one is $1 to $2, so it makes it training. I mean, we complain about gels, right? Like this makes training incredibly expensive, and very honestly, it doesn't probably make you all that much better. Um, because unless we are trying to set a world record by where like a tenth of a second or a hundredth of a second matters, then it just we're gonna do better to just probably put in more frequency and volume and work and not put so many barriers to our development. Because let's be honest, pricking yourself with a needle and testing every hour or every 30 minutes or every 15 minutes is just a barrier to us actually just doing work, right? Like I know people who have skipped workouts because they didn't have their watch on them. Um, let's not make even more of those things most of the time. So lactate testing, probably not going to be the jam. The other things we can use that are a little more realistic would be effort and heart rate. And if we're going to use heart rate, I do recommend a couple things. One, that you either use a chest strap or a an armband. I've heard mostly good reviews on the Coros armband. I know there's a couple other ones. I don't really know who makes them. Coros is the one kind of crushing it right now on that market. But they seem to have armband technology a little better. It's not perfect. A chest strap is pretty good. If sometimes it might not work very well for you, depending on your individual anatomy and depending on how much you hate feeling like you're being squeezed by a very weak person. So a chest strap, though, if you really care about using heart rate, is a thing that we should probably just learn to live with because it is so much more accurate than everything else. And when we look at heart rate, this is one of these things that is very much an art and a science. And there's a lot of validity to low heart rate training, and it can be used incredibly well, and we can use it to back up a lot and support a lot of training theory and modalities and etc. But it's going to change day to day. Your heart rate will shift. Your heart rate might change based on everything from like medications you take to how well you slept to whether or not you're sick. Like all of these things can manipulate this number. So you should probably not get completely set on the fact that like 150, for example, is your zone 2 number. It's going to swing by quite a few beats. And you have to take a lot of this data and kind of look at it for yourself and take the time to get used to these numbers if we're going to use them well, which is absolutely okay. I do spend a half probably of my training with a chest strap attached to me so that I have a better idea of what these numbers look like and so I can talk about them with people. But for the most part, I don't use it that often because after you do it for a while, you get it's a nice check. It's a nice backup. If you listen to David Roche talk about his use of it, it's a really good way to show that, hey, you actually can probably push harder here, which can be a useful thing if you're trying to set course records for 100 miles. But if we're just trying to get in some training, it might not be your best metric. It's not that it's useless. It's not that it's silly. It's not that it doesn't like actually have some purpose in your training. It's that it's not a be all end all. And if you are willing to play with it for a while, like months, if not a couple years, and really get a good idea of what your curves and numbers and like shifts look like, then we can absolutely use this um, as a really effective addition to some other metrics in our training. But if you're not, if you just want to like take a test or get some numbers or do a 220 minus your age or 180 minus your age and call that a day, then you're probably not going to get a lot out of it because it's not going to be particularly accurate, especially because a lot of these guesses work, like these numbers and these targets work across a populace. Like they're very good metrics when it comes to an average, but all of these things are on a bell curve, and it's very likely that you're not smack dab in the middle of it. So if I were to take 180 minus my age, it actually shoots me underneath. My max heart rate is higher than the 220 minus my age metric by about 10 beats. My max heart rate is somewhere in the low to mid 190s last I saw it, and the last time I tried to kill myself on a treadmill. So if I were to use these numbers and these estimates, then it just wouldn't be very helpful because it would underestimate all of my targets. All right, and this is like quick side note. This is also true, like this is also another reason that we might not use these metrics because they don't always go across sports. If you talk to a really high level triathlete, they will have different heart rate targets for their different sports. You will have different heart rate targets for different zones in the pool than you will running. So also keep that in mind. They're also not a be all end all for that reason, but they can be useful if you're willing to take the time to experiment and learn and figure out how they actually integrate with the rest of your stuff. All that said, heart rate is still a really good metric, partially because it's so accessible. A heart rate monitor doesn't cost that much. It's a bit of an extra expense, but considering how much we all spend on this sport anyway, if it's a thing you want to use to dial in your training, it is like much more long-term affordable than something like consistent lactate testing. And brings me to the most affordable and arguably best option, or what should probably be the base of pretty much all of our training, is some level of effort. And we should learn to cover effort metrics and not overthink it. I think this is where a lot of us lose track of effort or don't really know if we're hitting the right thing. It's because all of these things we read on the internet and all the science that we go through gives us this idea that we can have this like false sense of certainty. And I think that's what really makes me tired, I guess, or kind of exhausts me about a lot of the conversations I see out there about training and the internet, is that it presents this certainty that we're going to get progress, or we're going to hit the certain thing, and if only you do this, then you're going to make progress faster than everybody else has ever made progress in the history of time. And it's just not true. There's very little that is going to be that certain, and there's very little that's going to be that certain when it comes to training. You are going to have to play around a bit. We're going to have to experiment. You're going to have to test things and see if they work, and then test something else to see if it works. There's not going to be this like cheat code to faster progress. So with that said, effort is a really nice metric because we don't have to have any extra gear, and no matter what we're doing, we should still use effort as a like another check, right? Like your lactate testing, if you choose to go the expensive route, combined with heart rate, combined with effort, is all going to be a part of the picture. If we're going to add any of these number-based or data-based targets, then they should be integrated into a base of effort, not the other way around. We're not trying to start with heart rate and then use a like effort metric in addition to that. The effort is your base, and then the like heart rate might be additive onto that effort in order to get a little more progress, right? So if we look at effort, then we'll see things like zone 1 or zone 2 or recovery or easy or any of these things, and should have a basic idea or some basic targets of what this might be. Now, I'm someone for whom a lot of generalized effort targets might not work very well because I don't have a like normal full nasal passage. Even post surgery at 19, they were only able to widen my nasal passage to like 60% of what's considered normal. So I don't intake air very well. So when someone tells me to breathe through my nose while doing any sort of cardiovascular activity, that's a pipe dream, right? Like I just can't actually do that. I can barely breathe through my nose while sitting on the couch. I, I can, or to that point, but through my entire childhood, I couldn't. So we do have to understand that there are like individual restrictions that we might experience that limit some of these targets. That said, if we're going to take some base metrics that's going to cover for most people, then there's a recovery effort. And for most of us, this is going to involve walking, even on flat ground. And it might involve some brisk walking. It might be run walk intervals, but it is going to probably involve some walking unless you are very conditioned and your easy pace is pretty high. So recovery would typically be an effort where you can sing a song fairly well, or as well as you're going to sing one, right? I'm not a good singer. Nobody would ever accuse me of being a good singer, but as well as I can sing, that would be a recovery effort for the most part, right? Like I shouldn't be having to huff for breath. I shouldn't be struggling to have this conversation. I should be able to listen to my music, jam along to it, and sing along with it if we're going to consider it a true recovery effort from a cardiovascular standpoint. And this is going to be something probably like 50 or 60% or whatever of your max heart rate. It's going to be low. And again, that will differ. Even if you look at heart rate targets, depending on the company you're looking at, depending on the blog you're looking at, depending on the scientific research you're looking at, these like ranges will vary by 5 to even sometimes even more percentage points, which can be pretty significant. If we're going to be honest, that can be 10 beats if your heart rate max is 200. So even if we are going to use heart rate targets, we have to understand that scientifically there's some deviation of what we consider proper zones. So uh, just consider that. Anyway, recovery. Probably some pace you can sing a song. Easy. A pace that you can have a conversation, but probably not sing a song. Pace that you can have a conversation, but you might not want to have one. A pace that you can have a conversation, but somebody would probably know that you're doing some sort of activity. And this is the one that we hear a lot. Easy, it should be the bulk of your training. Easy is, it is not a pace, it is an effort. And it is an effort that is important to kind of dial in. It is an effort that everybody overthinks, partially because of these vague descriptors. Like, you should be able to have a conversation that you probably shouldn't want to be having. You should be able to have an easy conversation. Any of these things are going to be a little vague. But I would, again, ask you to not overthink it. Like, if you're running with a buddy, talk to the buddy. Can you have that conversation? Can you communicate with your friend on a run? Could you make a phone call on the run? If so, you're probably good, right? Like, that shouldn't be that hard for us to understand. And I think it's only hard to understand because we try to get this false sense of certainty that just isn't going to come from any sort of real training. So call up a friend, and if you can have a good conversation with them on the phone while you're training, then we can probably say that you're in at least something resembling easy. Again, there also isn't a perfect line, right? Like, there's nothing really to fear here. If you're 5 beats too high on your heart rate, you're not losing all of your aerobic development. You're just still going a little too hot. So don't overstress this either. I don't think you should be running most of your easy work at a pace that's like really working you. Don't lie to yourself and say that like just because you can get 5 words out at a time that you can have a conversation. But also don't hold back your progress because we're trying to get this false sense of specificity from something that just isn't that specific. So call up a friend. If you can have a good conversation with them on the phone through the entirety of your run, then that's probably a really good easy target. If you're running with somebody, have a conversation with them. If not, maybe talk to yourself like a crazy person. I will absolutely do that. I do that on the gym. I do that on the treadmill. And it's partially just a metric to see where I am from an effort standpoint. I'll sing along to music for a little bit quietly. I don't want to disturb anybody else. But I will say words to make sure that it's working well. You don't have to guess whether you can have a conversation. You could just have one with yourself or with your friend and see if it's a conversational pace. Now, the next one we might talk about is like lactate threshold. There's a few things that are going to be in here. Most of this, if we're going to talk the zone structure, is going to be zone 3. But this is going to be a pace where you might be able to say a sentence. If you listen to someone like Steve Magnus, he used a metric of, can you get out the phrase like, I feel good, I feel great, I can still communicate, and then have to take some level of decent breath at the end. You're not gasping for air, but you probably have to take an actual breath. That's a decent metric, I would say. Like, we're looking for some effort, so kind of a little faster than marathon pace, and you're pushing. You probably be sucking wind a little more than you'd want to be talking to a friend, but you could have a somewhat stilted conversation. And I'm sure we've all had these talks while like running on the trails and maybe going uphill, and we're trying to keep going the conversation we were having on the flats. And it just becomes a little more like um, the pauses become longer as we go up the hill. That's kind of our lactate stuff, right? And it doesn't need to be perfectly at threshold. Again, I don't think anybody listening to this is trying to train for the Olympics. If you were, buy a lactate monitor. But if not, then try and say a couple sentences and see if you can get them out well, and then have to take a breath afterwards. Say the phrase that I just said. See if you can say, like, I can say this sentence very well, right? If you can say that and then have to take a decent breath afterwards, then you're probably somewhere in that lactate space. And that's a good place to be for these like zone 3 LT workouts, and that's any of those intervals. And this will also probably be at a heart rate that's what is it, 80% or something, 70-ish, 75, depending on which research you're looking at. Please don't quote me. You can look that up on the internet. We all have Google. But this is a um, target that the zone 3 target that produces a decent amount of lactate and works a lot on lactate clearance is also pretty wide. So if anything, if you think you're probably going a little hot on this, go a little easier, because a lot of the time, for most people who are going to do endurance sports, it changes a little bit with muscle fiber type, but that's not a thing that most of us need to concern ourselves with, because again, we're not trying to win the Olympics. But if we are looking to train lactate, we're almost always going to be a little better off being a little too low than we are a little too high. It doesn't mean we should be able to sing a song. It doesn't mean we should be in that easy pace. But it does mean that you shouldn't be breathing like this and telling yourself that it's a lactate threshold pace, because it's clearly not, because I clearly wasn't able to get out a sentence at that. I was able to only like say one word at a time, which brings me to that top end. And this is going to be like zone 4, zone 5. You may only be able to say a couple words. You may not really want to speak at all. And this is where we're going to do like zone 2 work. This is how you might feel after a sprint. This is how you're not going to really get there during a proper sprint, because you are your heart rate and breathing are going to be a slightly like delayed reaction. So you're probably not going to be at the distance long, or that pace long enough during a proper sprint to get there, but you might see your heart rate elevate to this afterwards. And these are like, that effort is what we'll hit during like our 1 minute or our 2 minute or our 4 minute repeats at that, what we often call like VO2 max, or like high end zone 4, zone 5 work. And I talk to a lot of people who are ultra runners and marathoners who love working this like low and easy. They've built up a lot of weekly volume, and they almost forget how to do work at this place. And this is a topic for a different day, but this pace is not comfortable. Your heart feels like it's going to kind of jump out of your chest. And until you get used to it, you might be a little concerned that you're pushing too hard, and you might be. We should be able to maintain a pretty similar pace if we're doing these on flat ground across the entire like 3 minute interval or whatever we're trying to do. But it is not easy. This is hard work when we're up here. Should be no question. You're not trying to win sprints either, though. Like, maintain your distance form, run well, keep a pace that like a mile race pace would be really good for a couple minute threshold for most of us. A fucking hard 5K would be really good for some of this work for most of us. But if we're looking at repeats and intervals, we are trying at this high end. It is a pace that you probably only want to say a couple words at a time. Probably can only say a couple words at a time, and it just feels unpleasant. It also tends to be really rewarding. Like, this is the kind of hard work that afterwards gets your adrenaline and your endorphins and everything really up. But in the moment of it, it's tough. So when we look at effort, sorry that this probably didn't relay a ton of specifics, which we can like push the easy button on with your training. But that's kind of the point. There isn't an easy button. And no matter what, we're going to spend either work in the sense that we have to do a lot of testing, do a lot of lactate testing, and then jab ourselves with a needle every time we run, or we're going to do work in the sense that you're just going to experiment with it and try to figure out what this stuff feels like. It's work no matter what. It just depends which kind of work you want to do and which kind you can literally afford to do. But no matter what, it's going to take time and experimentation and trying to figure it out. You're not going to read a blog or listen to a podcast and then immediately know, oh, I need to work at this exact effort to make this exact progress so I can run the best marathon of my life in 4 weeks. That is just not how training works. If we get a little more data and we're able to integrate it all together and use it as one like cohesive indicator of how we're training, that's great. But I do like implore you to not try to fast track this progress or process. I ask you to understand that it is going to take some work of understanding to figure out what these are. So if we're looking at some basic metrics, recovery, probably be able to sing a song. If you're doing easy work, you should be able to have a good conversation with somebody. You may not want to, it may be a little like heavy on the breathing for that, but your conversation shouldn't be affected. You should be able to talk about whatever you want to at any length and be fine. When it comes to lactate work, you should be able to say a couple sentences at a time. This means you can probably still have a conversation, but it's certainly not a conversation that like you'd want, I don't know, recorded or used for whatever, right? Like, it's going to have a lot of heavy breathing and a lot of breaks in it, but you could still get your ideas out. And then when we start to push above that, we're able to only say a couple words at a time, and that's going to be where we end up in this like VO2 or high end or sprinting kind of paces. And we can dial these in, we can figure it out, we can work to heart rate, we can do all the stuff, but I just ask you, please don't overthink this. We know pretty inherently, if we're honest with ourselves and do a little bit of work, what recovery and easy are. And we know what hard is. It feels like your heart's pounding out of your chest. And we can kind of find that on that scale. And as long as we understand that all training, like all a rising tides raise all ships, right? Like, some of it's better for other things. Certain percentages of it of our overall training are probably applicable if we don't want to get injured, right? Like, you just can't train enough volume to get better at running if you do all of your work at a high VO2. It's like a VO2 max, high threshold stuff. But if we just do our best and try and put in the work, you're probably going to be okay. And if you have any questions on how to figure that out or what that might look like, shoot me a message, shoot me a DM on Instagram, or shoot me an email, or if you have my number, just text me, and I am happy to help you try to figure this stuff out. I hope you have a great day, and I'm going to try to keep doing these a little more frequently. Go have some fun on the trails, and if you can, run an extra mile for me while I have this busted foot. See ya. Thank you again for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Just a reminder, nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice, and you should always speak with a medical professional before making changes to your training or your nutrition.
If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please leave a rating or review. It tells the algorithm robots that people like it, and that means more people will hear it. Or even better, just share it with someone who you think would benefit. If you prefer a video version, head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook, or check out the Mountain Goat Endurance Coaching YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great next run.